The wind outside the great hall howled like something alive. Ilara could feel it pressing against the stone walls, rattling the high iron chandeliers that lit the chamber with their orange, unsteady glow. She stood at the far end of a room full of soldiers, council members, and pack leaders from across the kingdom, and every single pair of eyes was on her. She had not planned to be here tonight. No one from her pack had been invited to the Blood Moon ceremony. The summons had arrived without explanation, carried by a royal messenger who would not answer her questions. It had simply said, "Come." And so she had come, traveling 3 days on foot through mud and forest, arriving at the gates of Selim Draven's kingdom in the early hours of the evening with dust on her boots and her heartbeat too loud in her ears. She had felt the pull the moment she crossed through the palace gates. It was not subtle. It was not the soft, dreamy sensation the older women in her village had described when they spoke of finding a fated mate. It was like something in her chest had been turned by a key she did not know existed, and now it was open, and the feeling rushing into it was overwhelming and terrifying and impossible to name. She had stopped walking. She had pressed her hand flat against the stone wall of the outer corridor and stood there breathing slowly until she was able to move again. She had told herself it was nerves. She had walked into the great hall, and the moment she saw him standing at the head of the room with his back turned to her, she had understood. She had known before he turned around. She had known from the way the pull in her chest intensified until it was almost painful, from the way her wolf stirred for the first time in months, from the way the air in the room seemed to change. His name was Selim Draven. He was the Alpha King. He was the most powerful man in the known territory, and he looked like it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in deep charcoal with no decorations except for the single silver chain around his throat that marked his rank. His hair was dark and cut close. When he turned, his eyes were a pale gray that was nearly colorless, and they were filled with something cold and deeply tired, the eyes of a man who had not rested in a very long time. He looked at her. For one moment, she saw it. A flicker. Something fast and involuntary that moved across his face and then disappeared so quickly she would have missed it if she had blinked. His jaw tightened. His fingers closed into a fist at his side. And then the coldness returned, and it was harder than it had been before, as if he had pushed something down inside himself and sealed it shut. The room was very quiet. One of his senior advisors leaned close and said something near his ear. Selim did not look at the man. His pale eyes stayed on Ilara, and the longer he looked at her, the more the something behind his gaze seemed to curdle into anger. She did not know what to do. She stood there in her traveling clothes with her hands at her sides and tried to hold herself still. She had no crown. She had no title. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a border pack family of no particular standing, and she was standing in the most powerful room in the kingdom being stared at by the Alpha King with an expression she could not fully read. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say something simple and true, like, "I felt it too." Or, "I did not ask for this, but I am here." But her voice would not come. One of the council members at the long table stood. "My king," he said. "The ceremony requires acknowledgement. If there has been a recognition, tradition demands." Silence. Selim's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The single word filled every corner of the room and stopped everything in it. He took 3 steps forward. Then he stopped. He looked at Ilara with those pale, exhausted, furious eyes, and he said words in the old tongue that she had heard only once before, spoken at a funeral, used then to sever a bond that death had already broken. In the old stories, a living alpha had never used them. They were for mourning. They were not meant to be used like a weapon while the other person was standing right in front of you, still breathing, still hoping. She felt it happen. She had no other way to describe it. The thing that had opened in her chest when she crossed through the gates was closed again, but not gently, not the way you might close a door. It was as if it had been slammed shut from the outside, and the impact of it moved through her entire body. Her knees gave. She did not fall because a woman standing near her caught her by the arm, a stranger, someone she had never met, who held her up with both hands and whispered something she could not hear. The room erupted. Not in noise, but in the particular kind of silence that is louder than noise, the kind that follows something that cannot be undone. Ilara straightened. She did not know how. Some part of her that had survived everything else in her life took over, and she straightened, and she looked at him. Not with anger, not with tears, though both were there, layered beneath the surface. She looked at him the way you look at someone you are trying to understand and cannot. He had already turned away. That was the moment that stayed with her longest, in the years that came after. Not the words in the old tongue. Not the pain that moved through her like a current. It was the turn of his back, the way he simply faced the council table again and said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "Continue." The woman who had caught her arm guided her out of the hall. She was small and older, with silver-streaked hair and the quiet, careful manner of someone who had seen many terrible things and learned to move through them without flinching. She did not ask if Ilara was all right. She seemed to understand that the question would be unkind. In the outer corridor, Ilara sat on a stone bench and stared at the floor. Her hands were in her lap. She noticed they were shaking and she could not make them stop. The woman sat beside her and said nothing for a while. Then, quietly, she reached into the inner pocket of her coat and produced a small envelope. The paper was old, cream-colored, and sealed with dark wax in a shape Ilara did not recognize. The woman held it out. "Do not open this now," the woman said. Her voice was low and careful, like someone speaking near something fragile. "Perhaps not for a long time. But keep it. There are things in this world that cannot be understood in the moment they happen. Some truths need distance to be seen clearly." Ilara took the envelope. She did not know why. Later she would ask herself why she had taken it without question, why she had tucked it into the inside of her coat and held it there against her ribs for the long, silent walk back to the guest quarters she would not sleep in, where she would collect the single bag she had brought and leave before dawn without a word to anyone. She would not be able to explain it. She only knew that the woman's eyes had been very steady and very sad, and that whatever was in the envelope felt like something she was not ready to know. She left the kingdom before the sun came up. She walked out through the servants' entrance at the back of the outer wall, where the guards were changing shifts and no one was looking. She walked until the palace was no longer visible, and then she kept walking. Behind her, in the great hall, the blood moon ceremony continued without her. The council members took their seats. The maps were unrolled. The war discussions resumed. And the Alpha King stood at the head of his table and gave orders in a voice that did not waver, and if the slight stiffness in his posture meant anything, no one in that room was brave enough to say so. The sealed letter rested in the inside pocket of a traveling coat, pressed against a young woman's heartbeat, unread. It would stay that way for 3 years. The city was called Fenmore, and it was the kind of place where no one asked questions. It was not a famous city or a beautiful one. It sat at the edge of the northern territories where the wolf packs held no authority, sandwiched between a river that flooded every spring and a stretch of industrial streets that smelled of oil and rain. The people who lived there were mostly human, mostly working, mostly too tired by evening to be curious about their neighbors. Ilara arrived on a cold morning in early November, 3 days after she had crossed the border out of pack territory for the first time in her life. She had been walking or riding borrowed transport for most of the journey and she was exhausted in a way that went deeper than her muscles. She had no plan. She had 22 coins, a change of clothes, the sealed envelope, and a name she had decided to stop using. She had found the bakery by accident. The previous owner, a man named Conrad who was old and tired and whose hands hurt him now in winter, had a hand-lettered card in his window that said, "Help needed, early hours, honest pay." She had knocked. He had looked at her for a moment, asked her if she could carry heavy things and walk without talking too much, and she had said yes to both. That was the beginning. Within 6 months, Conrad had offered her the back room to sleep in. Within a year, he had handed her more and more of the actual work, showing up only a few mornings a week and leaving early. When he died of a quiet heart failure on a Tuesday morning 18 months after she arrived, she found that he had left her the lease and the equipment and a note that said, "You kept this place alive. Keep doing that." So she did. She learned the city the way you learn a language by living inside it, slowly and through repetition. She learned which suppliers were reliable and which ones needed following up. She learned that the woman 3 doors down, a retired school teacher named Audrey, liked a plain scone on Thursdays and would talk for 40 minutes if you let her. She learned that the young men who came in on weekends wanted something sweet and strong and would tip well if you remembered their orders. She learned that the city had a rhythm and that if you moved inside it steadily and quietly, it would eventually accept you. She chose the name Lena Ward, and she used it so consistently and so calmly that after a while it began to feel less like a disguise and more like another layer of herself, one she wore on the outside. She suppressed her wolf deliberately and carefully. This was not easy. It was the kind of thing that required daily attention, like keeping a door held shut against wind. She had learned, in the first few months, that she could not afford to let it surface. Her eyes would change color. Her reflexes were too fast. Once, early on, she had caught a falling glass before it hit the floor with a speed that made the only other customer in the shop go very still and look at her in a way she had not liked. After that, she was more careful. She moved at human pace. She let small things fall. She kept her eyes down in bright light. The sealed envelope lived in the drawer of the small table beside her bed. She had moved it from her coat to that drawer on the first night she slept in Conrad's back room, and it had stayed there. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a sound that is almost too quiet to hear. Sometimes, on nights when she could not sleep and the city outside was very still, she would open the drawer and look at it. She never touched it. She would close the drawer again and lie in the dark until morning. She was not hiding from something, she had told herself in those first months. She was simply living somewhere else. The distinction had felt important. It felt less important as time went on. Danny Cole came into the bakery on a Tuesday afternoon in Ilara's second year in Fenmore, arguing loudly on her phone with someone who appeared to be her landlord, gesturing with her free hand, and walking directly into the edge of a display shelf with her shoulder. She had stopped, looked at the shelf to confirm it was still standing, and then looked at Ilara and said, without any particular embarrassment, "I'll take whatever smells the best and also a large coffee if you have it." Ilara had liked her immediately and had been madly suspicious of this fact, because she had not liked anyone immediately in a very long time. Danny was a freelance illustrator who worked from a rented studio 2 streets over and had a personality that moved through spaces the way weather does, not aggressively but thoroughly, touching everything. She was funny in the dry, tired way of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it but had not yet stopped finding it interesting. She asked questions but did not press when answers were short. She filled silences comfortably, which meant that Ilara's silences did not feel like walls when Danny was around. She came in 3 or 4 mornings a week. After a while, she started staying to talk. After a while longer, she would occasionally help behind the counter when it was busy, with no instruction and no prompting, simply moving into the space where help was needed and doing useful things there. Ilara had told her once, carefully, that she did not talk about her past. Danny had said, "Okay," and had genuinely seemed to mean it. Ilara had not had a friend since before the blood moon. She was not sure she remembered how to be one. But she practiced, slowly, the same way she had practiced everything else in Fenmore, steadily and without rushing, and Danny seemed to understand that something careful was happening and gave it room. In the kingdom, things were not going well. The council meetings had been growing longer and louder. The border skirmishes that had been a manageable concern for years were intensifying. 3 of the Eastern Park leaders had stopped returning diplomatic messages. The Treasury report showed numbers that Sealam's finance minister kept trying to soften before presenting, and Sealam kept asking for the real ones. None of this was unprecedented. Kingdoms had difficult seasons. The particular difficulty of this one, though, was harder to explain in council terms. Sealam had noticed it first in small ways. He was slower to rise in the mornings. The cold that had never bothered him was bothering him. He found, sometimes, that he was in the middle of a sentence in a meeting and had lost track of where the sentence was going, not because his mind had wandered but because something in him had gone briefly and inexplicably dim, as if a light in an adjacent room had flickered. He began to sit during sparring practices, which he had never done. He began to sleep longer and wake less rested. He did not discuss this with anyone. He was the Alpha King. You did not discuss the dimming of yourself with advisors whose ability to respect you depended on you appearing to be undimmable. But his best fighter, a man named Owen, who had known him since they were both 14 and was the only person in the palace who addressed him without any particular ceremony, had said to him one morning after a sparring session that had gone badly, "You need to eat more. You're losing strength." And then after a pause, "Or eat something else." Selim had not answered. Owen had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You know what I think it is." "I know what you think," Selim said. "I didn't ask." Owen had nodded and let it go, because that was what Owen did. He said the thing once and then let it go, which was one of the reasons Selim had kept him close for so long. What Owen thought was what the old text said, what the traditions maintained, what every elder who had ever studied Pak law would have told Selim if he had ever asked any of them. A rejected bond did not simply end. It transferred. The rejection did not dissolve the connection. It redirected it, turning what would have been a source of strength into a slow and steady drain. The mate survived because the bond still existed. The alpha drained because the bond, which should have been a channel flowing both ways, was now flowing only out, one direction, feeding nothing. Selim had known this. He had known it when he spoke the words on the night of the blood moon. He had known it as clearly as he had known his own name. He had said them anyway, in the burning white heat of that night, in the wreckage of grief and fury and betrayal that had not yet cooled to the point where thinking was possible, and he had told himself he had no choice. He was not sure anymore that this was true. He stood at the window of his private chamber most evenings now after the council sessions, looking out at the training grounds that were quiet in the dark, and he tried not to think about a pair of dark eyes that had looked at him across a room with something that was not accusation or anger but was somehow harder to bear than either of those things would have been. He had told himself he had no choice. He told himself that again on a Thursday evening in early November, standing at the window in the dark, while somewhere far to the north, in a city he had not yet found, a woman named Lena Ward who had once been called Ilara was closing up a bakery for the night and saying goodbye to her friend and walking back through the dark to the small room where a sealed envelope lay in a drawer, unread. He had no choice. He wondered, in the silence of the empty chamber, if he had ever believed that. The morning the two men appeared at the bakery door, Ilara was alone. It was early, before the first customers, before Danny's usual arrival, in the hour when the ovens were hot and the street outside was still dim and the city had not yet fully woken. She had been moving between the counter and the back room with the automatic ease of something she had done thousands of times, and when the door opened, she assumed it was a delivery. It was not a delivery. There were two of them. They were large, dressed in civilian clothes that did not sit naturally on them, the clothes of men who usually wore something more formal and were not entirely comfortable in this disguise. She knew what they were before either of them spoke. She knew by the way they moved and by the specific quality of their stillness when they stopped inside the door, scanning the room with their eyes before they looked at her. She set down the tray she was carrying. She kept her hands visible. She said, very calmly, "The shop is not open yet." The taller one said, "Ilara Vos." She had not heard that name in 3 years. It moved through her like cold water. She said, "You have the wrong person." "We don't," the second one said. He was shorter, with a careful, neutral expression that told her he had done this kind of thing many times and had learned not to invest himself in the reaction. "We were sent by the Alpha King. He is requesting your return to the kingdom." "He is requesting," Ilara repeated. She let the word sit in the air between them. "Yes. And if I decline the request?" The two men exchanged a glance that was brief and practiced and told her everything about how this conversation was supposed to go. She understood, in that glance, that the word request was doing quite a lot of work that it had not entirely been built to do. She said, "I am not Pak. I have not been Pak since I crossed the border 3 years ago. I have no legal obligation to answer a summons from a king who has no authority in this territory." "That is technically accurate," the taller one said, and the way he said it told her it was meant to be a concession and also the end of that particular argument. She looked at them both steadily. Her wolf, which she had been suppressing for 3 years with careful daily effort, was not suppressed now. It was very close to the surface, not aggressive, but alert in the way that meant her instincts had decided that alertness was now a priority. She could feel it in the slight heightening of her senses, the way the room had become more detailed, every shadow sharper. She said, "Sit down." They both looked at her. "Sit," she said again. "I am going to put on coffee and you are going to tell me why he sent you himself instead of going through official channels, and you are going to tell me the truth." They sat. She made coffee. She brought it to the small table in the corner that she kept for customers who wanted to sit, and she sat across from them with her own cup and she waited. The shorter one spoke first, and what he said pulled the floor slightly out from under her, quietly and without drama, the way the most significant things often arrive. He said, "The king is losing strength. It has been happening for 2 years, possibly longer. His ability to shift has become inconsistent. His endurance in training has dropped significantly. The council knows something is wrong. They do not know what." "And you know what?" Ilara said. "We know what the texts say about rejected bonds." Silence. She looked at her cup. She did not drink from it. "He is not well," the shorter man said. "We are not asking you to return for his comfort or to forgive him anything. We are asking because without intervention, what is happening to him will continue, and the kingdom is already destabilizing because of it, and there are people within that kingdom who are using the instability to consolidate power in ways that will cause a great deal of harm to a great many people." "That is a very organized speech," Ilara said. "I have given it several times in my head on the drive here." She almost smiled. She stopped herself. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the taller one, who had said nothing and was watching her with the kind of attention that meant he had been told she was perceptive and was deciding whether that was accurate. She said, "Why now? He has known what is happening to him. He would have known from the beginning. Why is he sending for me now, 2 years into it, instead of a year ago or 3 years ago?" The shorter man was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he said, "Because there is someone on the council who has been advising him that the bond would simply fade over time. And 6 weeks ago, the king discovered that this person has been actively suppressing the reports about his declining strength so that no one else on the council was aware of the full picture." Ilara was very still. "And when he understood what had been suppressed," the man continued, "and why, he began to look at other things that had been suppressed. He found several, including the circumstances of his mother's death." The words were quiet. They were ordinary words in an ordinary order. They landed in Ilara's chest with a weight that had nothing ordinary about it. She said, "What about his mother's death?" "Her death was not accidental," the man said. "We believe she was killed on the night of the blood moon, 3 years ago, by members of the current council. We believe she was killed because she was going to do something that would have prevented them from gaining the influence they now hold." Ilara said nothing. Her hand had moved, without her deciding to move it, to the inside of her coat, where there was no envelope because she was not wearing that coat. The envelope was in her room. It was in the drawer. It had been in the drawer for 3 years, pressed beneath the few other things she kept in there, and she had not opened it and she had not thrown it away and she had not let herself think about it too clearly because something in her had always known that thinking about it too clearly would mean having to decide something she was not ready to decide. She stood up. The 2 men watched her. She said, "Wait here." She walked through the back of the shop and up the narrow stairs to her room above it. She opened the drawer. The envelope was exactly where it always was, the old cream paper gone slightly soft at the edges from years of the drawer being opened and closed around it. The wax seal was still intact. She picked it up. She sat on the edge of her bed. She had carried this thing for 3 years and she had never opened it, and now she understood, sitting in the pale early light of a November morning with 2 royal enforcers waiting in her shop below, that the reason she had never opened it was not because she was not ready. It was because some part of her had been waiting until she could bear to know what was inside it, and that part of her had understood, even if the rest of her had not, that the knowing would change something permanently. She broke the seal. The wax cracked cleanly. The letter inside was handwritten in a clear, formal script. The paper was stained with age and the ink had faded slightly, but the words were readable, every one of them. It was addressed to her family. Her parents. It was signed with the name of Selim's mother, the former queen, Vera Draven. And it had been written on the morning of the blood moon. It said, "By the time you receive this, the ceremony will have concluded and my son will have met his fated mate. I am writing to ask you not to be afraid, and not to allow your daughter to be afraid either, because I know that what is coming will be overwhelming and that my son does not know how to be gentle with things that overwhelm him. He was not taught. That is my failure, and I am trying now, too late perhaps, to correct it. I recognized your daughter's name when the moon goddess's confirmation came to me through the old channels, 3 days ago. I know your family. I knew your grandmother. I want you to know that I believe the choice is a good one and that I intend to welcome her myself and to stand beside her at the ceremony so that she does not stand alone in that room. I know how that room can feel. I have stood in it myself, long ago, when I was young and frightened and had no one beside me. I want her to have someone beside her. I am writing this quickly because there are things happening tonight that I do not fully understand yet, and I want this letter to exist in the world before the evening comes. I am asking you to trust my son, because under the anger and the armor there is someone worth trusting. I am asking your daughter to be patient with him. I am sorry I cannot tell you more. I will tell you more when the morning comes." The letter ended there. It was not signed off. It simply ended, mid-thought, as if the writer had been interrupted or had run out of time. Ilara sat with it in her hands for a long time. Outside the window, the city was waking up. She could hear the sounds of it, the early traffic, a voice somewhere below on the street, the distant percussion of the city beginning its day. She read the letter again. Then once more. Vera Draven had woken up on the morning of the blood moon to write a letter of welcome to the family of a young woman she had never met, because she had wanted that young woman to not stand alone in a room full of strangers. She had written it quickly, sensing something, not knowing what. And then the evening had come, and she had not survived it. And her son had stood in that room, burning with grief that he did not yet know was grief because the people who had taken his mother from him had been careful about the timing, and he had looked at the young woman his mother had tried to welcome, and he had done the most destructive thing available to him in that moment. Ilara did not weep. She sat very still and she let the truth of it settle into her, the way you let yourself adjust to something that has permanently changed the shape of your understanding. He had been a boy whose mother was already gone. He had not known it yet. He had been burning and lost and surrounded by the people who had made him that way, and he had done a terrible thing. She understood the difference between a terrible thing and a terrible person. She had known people who confused the two, and she had always thought they were wrong. But understanding had never meant the same thing as forgiveness, and she was clear about that now, sitting in the early light, holding a letter that should have reached her 3 years ago. She folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She stood up. She went back downstairs. The 2 men were still at the table. They both looked up when she came in. She said, "I am not coming back to the kingdom to save him. I want that to be completely clear." The shorter one nodded. "I am coming back," she said, "because someone killed a woman who was trying to do a kind thing, and those people are still there, and they are using his weakness to do more damage, and I find that I am not willing to simply let that continue when I know about it." "Understood," he said. "I have conditions." The king expected that. "I am not moving back into the palace. I will work on the outside. I have contacts in the border packs that I have been in communication with for 2 years on unrelated matters, and those contacts may be useful." Both men went very still at this, in the way of people hearing something unexpected. She said, "Yes. I kept in contact with the border packs. I had reasons that had nothing to do with the kingdom, but the relationships exist. That is my value here, and I will use it my way." She poured the rest of her coffee out. She said, "I need 48 hours to arrange things here before I leave." "Of course," the shorter man said. "And I need you to understand that when I return, I am returning as myself. Not as an omega from a border pack. Not as someone who owes anyone anything. I am returning as someone who has information and capability that may be useful, and I expect to be treated accordingly. The shorter one said, the king will agree to that. The king, Ilara said quietly, does not get to agree or disagree. That is what I mean by returning as myself. There was a brief silence. Then the shorter man nodded, and the nod had something in it that was not quite deference and not quite agreement but was close enough to both that she accepted it. She walked them out. She stood in the doorway of her shop and watched them get into their vehicle and drive away down the still quiet street. Then she turned back inside and stood in the warm, flower-dusted air of the bakery that had been her whole world for 3 years, and she thought about Danny. She was going to have to explain something to Danny. Not everything. But something. She picked up her phone and sent a message, "Are you awake? I need to talk to you." 3 dots appeared almost immediately, and then, "I'm always awake. Come over." Ilara looked around the bakery. At the ovens, still warm. At the trays she had been preparing before the knock at the door. At the small table in the corner where she had sat with 2 strangers and heard a story that had rearranged everything she thought she had settled. She turned off the ovens. She went upstairs and began, methodically, to pack. The drive back to the kingdom took 2 days. Ilara sat in the back of the vehicle and watched the landscape change, first the flat industrial edges of the human city, then the long farmland of the outer territories, then the denser, older growth of the forest that surrounded the parklands. She recognized the trees when they changed. The air changed too, thicker, carrying something underneath it that she had not realized she had been missing until it came back. She had not told Danny everything. She had told her enough, that her real name was not Lina, that she came from a world that existed alongside the human one and had rules that humans did not know about, that she had left that world under difficult circumstances and was going back to try to fix something. Danny had sat across from her at the small kitchen table in her studio and listened to all of it with the particular stillness she had when she was paying real attention, and at the end she had said, "Are you safe?" Ilara had considered this honestly. "I don't know yet," she had said. "Probably not entirely." Danny had nodded slowly. "Will you tell me how it goes?" "Yes." "Okay." And then, after a pause, "The bakery door. What happens to the bakery?" They had figured it out together, which was so characteristic of Danny that it had made Ilara's chest ache in a way she had not expected. She had signed over a temporary management agreement to a neighbor who had once asked if she ever needed help. She had left enough money in the account to cover 3 months of operations. She had written out everything that needed to be known in a long, careful document that she left on the counter. She was not sure she was coming back. She was not sure she was not. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and she had decided not to resolve them before she had to. The vehicle crossed into park territory and she felt the shift in her body, the subtle loosening of something she had been holding for 3 years. Her wolf settled. It did not surge or push. It simply settled, the way a person settles into a chair that fits them, quietly and without ceremony. She looked out the window at the trees. Owen met them at the outer road, 3 miles from the palace gates, which told her that Selim did not want her arrival to be a public event, or that Owen had made that decision for him, which was equally possible. Owen was exactly as she had constructed him from the descriptions the enforcers had given her during the drive, a large man in his late 30s with an unhurried quality to his movements and eyes that took things in without making a performance of it. He looked at her when she got out of the vehicle and said, "Thank you for coming." "I'm not here for him," she said. "I know," Owen said. And unlike the enforcers, he did not add anything after that, no clarification or reassurance. He simply said it and let it be true. She appreciated that. They went in through a side entrance. The palace was larger than she remembered, or perhaps she had not been paying attention to its size the first time she was here, preoccupied as she had been with other things. The stone corridors were dim and cool and smelled of something she could not name, old wood and something like cold ash, the particular smell of a large building that is being heated inadequately. She noticed details as she walked, a crack running up one wall that had been patched but not fully repaired, a window with a broken latch that rattled as they passed, two council guards in the outer corridor who were talking to each other instead of watching the room. Small things. The kind of small things that added up to a picture. Owen led her to a room on the east side of the palace, not a guest room but a working room with a long table and maps and paper stacked with the organized chaos of something being actively used. He did not lead her to Selim first. She had wondered about that. She decided it was probably the right call. He spread the most recent map on the table and said, "Here is where we are." For the next 2 hours, he walked her through it. The Eastern Pack withdrawals, 3 pack leaders who had stopped communication 14 months ago and were now believed to be in contact with a faction within the council that was operating without the king's knowledge. The treasury irregularities, money moving in directions that the official records did not account for. The timing of events over the past 3 years that, when laid out side by side, had a pattern that was not coincidental. Who on the council? Ilara asked. Owen named 2 men. She did not recognize the names. Then he named a third, and she went still. Say that again, she said. He repeated the name, Aldrich Vane. She looked at the map for a moment. He was there, she said. On the night of the blood moon. He was the one who leaned close to the king before the rejection and said something in his ear. Owen looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. We believe so. She thought about that. She thought about a young queen sitting down to write a letter in the early morning hours, sensing something wrong, not yet knowing what. She thought about the specific cruelty of being taken at a moment when you were trying to do something kind. Tell me everything you have on him, she said. Owen told her. It took another hour. By the end of it, she had a clearer picture than she had expected, not a complete one. There were gaps and missing connections, but enough to understand the shape of what had been happening. Aldrich Vane had been positioning himself for years, quietly and carefully, building alliances within the council and influence with the Eastern Pack leaders, creating a structure of dependency that would give him real power in the kingdom without requiring him to be visibly in charge of it. Selim's declining strength was useful to him. A king who was losing power created a vacuum, and Vane had been preparing to fill it. The death of Vera Draven had been the beginning. She had known about Vane. She had been going to act. Ilara sat with all of this for a while. Then she said, "My contacts in the border packs. Some of them have been receiving pressure from the East. I thought it was unrelated political maneuvering. It's not unrelated." Owen leaned forward slightly. She said, 3 of the border pack leaders have been approached by representatives they describe as coming from the kingdom's Eastern Council faction. The approach has been framed as a trade and security agreement, but the terms require the border packs to route all communication with the main kingdom through the Eastern faction's designated liaisons. Meaning all information coming in or going out would pass through Vane. They told you this? Yes. Because I asked, and because I have spent 2 years building relationships with people who are not being heard and who find it useful to have someone they can tell things to. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is extraordinarily useful information." "I know," Ilara said. She was not being immodest. She was being accurate. He nodded slowly. "Would you be willing to document it in detail? Names, dates, the specific terms as described to you?" "Yes. I will also need to contact the pack leaders directly and inform them of what we now understand about the context." They made their decisions without knowing who they were actually dealing with. Some of them will reconsider when they know. That could shift the Eastern Alliance significantly. That's the intention. He looked at her with the expression of someone reassessing a situation they thought they had understood. She did not feel the need to respond to this. She let him reassess. Then he said, "He wants to see you." She had known this was coming. She had been sitting with it, quietly, behind all the information and analysis, the way you are aware of something waiting in the next room while you focus on what is directly in front of you. She said, "I know. Tonight, if you're willing. If not, he will wait." She thought about the letter, which was in her coat pocket now, which was where it had been for the entire drive here. She had moved it from the envelope to her pocket the morning she left Fenmore, for reasons she had not entirely articulated to herself. She said, "Tonight." "Yes." He led her through 2 more corridors to a smaller room near the back of the east wing. This room had a fire. The fire made the room feel different from the rest of the palace, warmer and more like a place where a person actually lived, and she noticed this and fired it away. Selim was standing near the window. He turned when she came in, and she saw immediately what 2 years of a draining bond had done. He was the same person she had seen across a great hall 3 years ago, the same broad frame and dark hair and pale grey eyes, but something about him was different in a way that was hard to pinpoint and impossible to miss once you saw it. He was thinner, but it was not just that. He moved carefully. He stood with a deliberateness that she recognized as the posture of someone managing something, conserving something, someone who had been walking on a road that goes gradually downhill and had learned to adjust their weight accordingly. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She looked back at him. She did not feel the pull the way she had 3 years ago, the wave of it, the key turning. The broken bond was not repaired by proximity. But she felt something, a low, persistent awareness, the way you feel an old weather in an old injury, present but not the same as pain. He said, "You came." "I said I would." A pause. He said, "I did not know if you would keep that word." "Given what I keep my word," she said. "That is not conditional on what other people have done." He absorbed this. He nodded once. She said, "I have been in the map room with Owen for 3 hours. I have information that is relevant to what is happening and I have a plan for using it. I would like to discuss the plan with you and Owen together, and I would like to do that tomorrow morning when I have slept and when you have had time to read the document I am going to prepare tonight." "All right," he said. "I am not here," she said carefully, "to have a personal conversation with you. Not tonight. Not yet. There is something I may want to say to you at some point, but not before I have done what I came here to do, because I need to be clear in my own mind about the order of things." He was quiet for a moment. She could see something moving behind his eyes, something he was choosing not to say, and she respected the choice. "Understood," he said. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the letter, creased now from having been folded and carried, and she held it out to him. He looked at it. He looked at the envelope, at the name written on it in his mother's handwriting, and something happened in his face that he did not manage to contain in time. It was brief, and then it was controlled, but she had seen it. He took the letter. She said, "I think you should read it alone." He nodded. She left the room. Owen was waiting in the corridor. She said, "Show me where I am sleeping, please." He did. She lay in the dark room that had been prepared for her, in the palace where she had never expected to return, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind outside the old stone walls, and she thought about a woman who had gotten up early one morning to write a letter of welcome and had not lived to deliver it. She thought about what she was going to do with the border pack information and how quickly she could move on it. She thought, briefly and with deliberate honesty, about the expression on Selim's face when he saw his mother's handwriting. Then she put the thoughts away, one by one, and went to sleep. She moved on Aldrich Vane in stages, not quickly and not visibly, the way you dismantle something that has been built over many years, from the outside in, quietly, removing the support before anyone notices the structure is moving. The first stage was the border packs. She spent 3 days writing carefully, individually composed messages to each of the 7 border pack leaders she had maintained contact with over the past 2 years. The messages explained, in clear and verifiable terms, who Aldrich Vane was, what his actual position within the kingdom's council hierarchy was, and what his relationship was to the events of 3 years ago. She did not overstate. She did not ask for anything in those first messages. She only laid out the truth and gave them time to sit with it. The responses began coming back on the 4th day. Not all of them were immediate allies. 2 pack leaders wrote back with cautious, non-committal responses that were essentially a polite way of saying, "This is interesting but we need to verify it ourselves." 1 pack leader did not respond at all, which she noted and set aside. But 4 of them responded with the kind of directness that told her they had been waiting for exactly this, for something concrete to hold on to, for confirmation that what had been happening to them was part of a pattern and not a series of unrelated pressures. One of them wrote, "We refused the Eastern Factions Liaison Agreement 4 months ago. Since then, 2 of our trade routes have been disrupted. We assumed this was coincidence. We no longer assume that." She forwarded this to Owen and to a woman named Petra, who was the palace's most senior legal advisor and who had, it turned out, been quietly building her own record of anomalies within the council for over a year and was extraordinarily pleased to have someone to compare notes with. The second stage was the Treasury. Petra had the legal authority to freeze an internal audit of council-adjacent financial accounts if she could demonstrate reasonable cause. The border pack communications, combined with the records she already held, gave her that cause. The audit began on the 8th day of Ilara's return, quietly and under a different pretext so that it did not immediately signal what it was looking for. What it found, within 3 days of looking, was significant. Not just the movement of funds. The record of where the funds had come from, which traced back to transactions with the Eastern Pac leaders who had been recruited by Vane, transactions that predated the breakdown in diplomatic communication by over a year. Which meant the breakdown had not been a breakdown. It had been a planned withdrawal, a deliberate severing of the Eastern Pacs from the main kingdom structure to create a separate power base with its own financial ties to Vane. Ilara sat with Owen and Petra and 2 other advisors she had come to trust over the preceding week and went through the financial documents page by page. They walked through the night on the 12th day, with coffee that was very strong and a fire that was kept fed, and by the time the first grey light came through the windows, they had a complete picture. Petra said, at the end of it, setting down the last document and pressing her fingertips to her forehead, "This is enough. This is more than enough. We can move on this legally and publicly." "Publicly," Ilara said. "That is important. Whatever happens next needs to happen in full view." "Agreed," Petra said. "Vane has allies on the council. If we move quietly, he has time to mobilize them. If we move publicly," Petra said, "there is no time. The evidence is presented to the full council simultaneously, and no one person can suppress it." "Yes." They looked at each other. "How quickly can you prepare the formal presentation?" Ilara asked. 2 days, Petra said. "One if I don't sleep." 2 days is better, Ilara said. "I need that time to make sure the 4 border pack leaders who are with us know what is coming and when, so they can make their own public statements simultaneously. Vane should not be able to turn to any direction and find support there." Owen, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, said, "The king." Both women looked at him. "He needs to know the full scope before the council meeting," Owen said. "Not a summary. Everything." "He will have everything," Ilara said. Owen nodded. "He wants to speak with you. Not about the plan. Separately." He said it simply, without pressure. "He has been asking. I told him I would tell you." She looked at the cold coffee in her cup. "I know," she said. "Tomorrow. After we've confirmed the timing with Petra." She said tomorrow and she meant it. She had been aware, over the past 2 weeks, of the careful distance Selim had kept, the deliberate way he had stayed out of the working space she had established, asking Owen for information rather than coming to her directly, being present in meetings when they needed him but taking a seat at the table rather than the head of it, at least in the rooms where she was also sitting. She had watched this and recognized it for what it was. She had not said anything. She found him the next afternoon in the smaller room with the fire, where she had first seen him after returning. He was reading when she came in, which she had not expected. Not documents, not reports, a book, an actual book with a cloth cover, and for a moment she stood in the doorway looking at him reading and saw something that none of the council meetings had shown her, something that was simply a person sitting quietly with a book, a person underneath all the other things. He looked up. He put the book down. She sat across from him. The fire between them was low. She said, "I have read the letter many times." He said, "So have I." A quiet moment. She said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked." He did not speak for a moment. Then, "She was." She was someone everyone liked. It was not a performance with her. It was just how she was. He paused. I didn't know. That night. I found out 3 days later, and by then, he stopped. I know, she said. He looked at her. I'm not saying that as an excuse. I know that too. He held her gaze. There was something there, behind the pale gray exhaustion, that she recognized as genuine. Not remorse in the theatrical sense, not apology designed to produce a particular response. Just something very honest and very tired. She said, what you did was destructive. It damaged me. The bond breaking the way it did left a mark that I am not certain is fully healable, and I think you should know that clearly rather than have me soften it. Yes, he said. Quietly and without flinching. I do not know what happens next between us, she said. I am not going to decide that today or this week or perhaps this month. I am going to do what I came here to do, which is to dismantle what Vane has built, and then I am going to exist in whatever comes after that and pay attention to what I actually feel rather than what I think I should feel. He nodded. But I want you to know, she said, and she had thought carefully about whether to say this, and decided that not saying it would be a kind of withholding that she did not want to be guilty of, that what is in that letter made me understand something about who you were in that room. Not what you did. Who you were underneath what you did. And I have been carrying that understanding for 2 weeks, and it has changed things. Not everything. But things. He was very still. She stood up. The council meeting is the day after tomorrow. Petra will walk you through the evidence this evening. I need you to be present, and I need you to be the alpha king when you are in that room, not because of your rank but because the pack leaders who will be watching need to see that the kingdom's center is holding. It's holding better than it was, he said. Since you returned? She looked at him for a moment. She did not answer that. She left. She walked back through the corridor and stood for a moment in the cold air of the outer passage, her hand flat against the stone wall, breathing slowly. She was not going to rush this. She had rushed nothing in 3 years, and she was not going to start now. But the letter had been right about one thing. Under the anger and the armor, there was someone worth the time it would take to see clearly. She pushed off the wall and went back to work. The council meeting was held at midday, in the Great Hall, which was the same room where the Blood Moon ceremony had taken place 3 years before. Ilara noticed this as she came in and then put it to one side. She had done with symbolic weight what needed to be done. Now was for different work. There were 14 council members present. Aldrich Vane was among them, seated at the inner curve of the long table, dressed formally, his expression composed. He did not look at her when she entered. She noted this. He told her he had been warned, or had guessed that something was coming, but had decided that appearing unconcerned was more strategically useful than appearing alarmed. He had made a mistake in this calculation, and she suspected he knew it. Selim entered last and took his position at the head of the table. He stood rather than sat, which was not what he usually did. Owen had mentioned this detail, and the standing changed the quality of his presence in the room. He was the Alpha King, and he looked it in a way that he had not, according to Owen, for quite some time. Whether that was the approaching resolution of what had been draining him or simply the particular energy of this moment, she could not say. He said, "We are here because there is evidence that must be addressed. Petra will present it." Petra presented it. She was methodical and calm, which was the right tone. She did not dramatize. She laid the financial records on the table, one document at a time, explaining each one in clear language, and then she laid the communication records, and then the timeline of the Eastern Pack withdrawals with the payments preceding them documented in precise sequence. The room changed as she spoke. Ilara was watching it carefully, watching the council members' faces, reading the room the way she had learned to read the bakery in the early mornings, by its silences and its movements. For council members had known. She could see it in the particular quality of their stillness, too controlled, the stillness of people suppressing a response rather than having none. 2 of those 4 were looking at Vane. He was not looking back at them. The other 10 ranged from shock to calculation to a particular kind of angry clarity that she recognized as the expression of people who had suspected something was wrong for a long time and were now, unpleasantly, being confirmed. When Petra finished, she laid the last document on the table and stepped back. Silence. Then one of the senior PAC representatives, a man with white hair and 30 years on the council, said, "These records trace payments beginning 4 years ago." "Yes," Petra said. 4 years ago, the previous queen was still alive. "Yes." He looked at Vane. He did not say what he was thinking. He did not need to. Vane said, in a controlled voice, "These records are taken out of context. There are legitimate explanations for each of these transactions that Petra's presentation has deliberately omitted." "Then provide them," Selim said. Vane looked at him. Something passed between them, a very brief exchange, and in it Ilara saw something she had not anticipated. Vane was not afraid of Selim. He had been operating on the basis that Selim's strength was sufficiently diminished that he could be managed, and some part of him had not yet fully updated this assessment despite the evidence of the past 2 weeks. That was his second mistake. Selim said, quietly and without particular emphasis, "I would like you to provide the explanations now, in this room, in front of this council. Take as long as you need." Vane did not have the explanations. He tried. He spoke for several minutes, and the words were organized and confident, but they were not answers, they were maneuvering, and the council recognized it. She could see it in the way the room shifted, the specific quality of a group of people deciding, not all at once but each in their own moment, that the story they were being told was not the true one. When Vane had finished, the white-haired council representative said, "I would like to call for a formal suspension of council membership pending investigation." 2 others said, seconded, almost simultaneously. Vane stood. For a moment he looked at Selim with an expression that was no longer composed, and what was under the composure was not fear exactly but something colder and more bitter, the expression of someone who has been working towards something for a very long time and has just understood that it is not going to arrive. He said, "You brought her back." Meaning Ilara. His eyes moved to her briefly and then away. "This is her doing." Selim said, "She brought information. You created the situation the information describes. These are different things." Vane said nothing else. The formal suspension motion carried by 11 votes to 1. The 3 remaining members who had known abstained, which was, Ilara thought, probably the last useful political instinct they had managed today. Vane was escorted out by 2 palace guards. The meeting continued. Ilara had not spoken during the proceedings. She had sat to one side, visible but outside the formal table, which had been deliberate. This was not her counsel. She was not here to take Vane's seat. She was here as herself, as something the kingdom did not have a clean category for, and she was satisfied with that. After the meeting ended and the council members began to file out, she sat for a moment alone in the emptying hall, looking at the high ceilings and the iron chandeliers, which were lit in the afternoon and looked different in daylight than they had on the night she had first seen them. Less dramatic. More structural. More honestly what they were. Owen sat down beside her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "The Eastern PAC leaders will receive formal documentation of the investigation by tomorrow," he said. 2 of the 4 who are closely tied to Vane will need direct outreach. The other 2 have already indicated privately that they are willing to re-enter standard diplomatic channels. Yes. My contacts will handle the initial approach for the 2 difficult ones. People who already have relationships with them. Your people have been busy. My people have been building relationships for 2 years, she said. That is not the same as being busy. He smiled at this. It was a small smile, but genuine. She looked up at the chandeliers again. It will take time. The financial damage and the diplomatic fractures. They are not undone because one man is removed. No, Owen said. But the wound is clean now. Clean wounds heal. She thought about that. She said, "How is he?" Owen considered the question. "He stood in there today the way I haven't seen him stand in 2 years," he said. "Something has been returned to him." A pause. Not everything. But something. Good, she said. He is not going to make demands of you, Owen said. I want to say that plainly because I think it may not be obvious from the outside. He understands, I believe, in a way he probably should have understood a long time ago, what it means to have a debt that cannot be repaid. He is not expecting it to be ignored. But he is not going to press. She looked at her hands. I know, she said. I can see it. Can you, Owen said, and the two words had a quiet something in them that was not quite a question. She stood. I am going to Fenmore for a few days, she said. I have things there that need attending to. And I think some distance is useful for me right now. Of course, Owen said. He stood too. Will you come back? She thought about the bakery with the warm ovens and the city that had taken her in. She thought about Danny, who had hugged her at the door when she left and said, go fix it. She thought about the drawer with the empty envelope, the seal broken, the paper creased. She thought about a fire in a small room and a man sitting with a book, a person underneath everything. She said, yes. I will come back. She left the great hall through the side passage, not the main doors. Outside, the afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of cold that feels intentional, like a statement. 3 days later, she was back in Fenmore. She stood in the bakery at 5 in the morning, flour on her hands, the ovens running, the city still dark outside the windows. She was there for 4 days. She checked on the accounts, helped with inventory, had dinner twice with Danny and told her as much as could reasonably be told. On the last night, sitting at Danny's kitchen table with the city sounds coming in through the slightly open window, Danny said, are you going back? Yes, Ilara said. Because of the work. She thought about it honestly. Partly, she said. Danny nodded. She did not press. Ilara drove back to the kingdom on a morning in late November when the first light came through the car window pale and gold across the long empty road. She was not rushing. She was not certain of what came next, only that she was going toward it rather than away, and that this felt, for the first time in a long time, like the right direction. On her second day back, she found Salem in the corridor near the map room, coming from a council session. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped too. You came back, he said. I said I would. He nodded. He seemed about to say something and then didn't, and she was aware of the distance between them, the careful physical space, which was a kind of communication in itself. She said, I have not decided anything yet. I want you to know that. I am not here because I have decided. I am here because I am still thinking. I understand, he said. But I am not thinking from far away, she said. I am thinking from here. That is something. His expression changed. Not dramatically. But she saw it. She said, Owen tells me the investigation timeline for the financial case has been set at 3 months. Yes, he said. His voice had settled. There are additional documents Petra is working through. I want to be in those meetings. You will be, he said. No hesitation. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, the letter is framed. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. On the first day you went to Fenmore. She had not seen it yet. She knew which corridor it was in. She had heard from Owen, who had mentioned it without ceremony one morning over a working breakfast. He had said, he put your letter in the hall. The former one. Where the court decrees are kept. And she had nodded and said nothing, but had held the image of it for a while afterward. She said, show me. He walked with her through the south corridor to the former hall, where the kingdom's significant documents were kept behind glass in frames along one wall, treaties, accords, historical proclamations. At the far end, in a newer frame than the rest, was the letter. The cream paper, the faded ink, the words in his mother's handwriting. She stood in front of it and read it again, the 4th time, the 5th, she had lost count. It read the same as it always did. It did not read differently because it was in a frame. But something about seeing it here, in this space, among the other things the kingdom had decided were worth keeping visible, made it true in a different way. She stood there for a long time. Selim stood beside her, not touching, not speaking. After a while she said, "She would have been someone worth knowing." "Yes," he said. "She would have liked you. She would have liked you a great deal." Ilara looked at the letter in its frame. Outside the narrow windows of the former hall, the afternoon light was going, dropping behind the tree line, and the room was filling with the particular amber of late winter dusk. She thought about the past 3 years. About the bakery and the sealed drawer and the city that had held her without knowing what it was holding. About the border pack leaders and the careful messages and the relationships built quietly over time out of something that had started with nothing. About Petra and the documents spread across the table in the early morning. About Owen and his unhurried way of saying true things. She thought about what it meant to build something useful from wreckage, and whether the building was its own kind of answer. She did not know yet what she and Selim would become, if anything, in the time ahead. She did not know if what had been broken could be made into something new, not the same thing but something that accounted honestly for what it had been through. She was not willing to promise herself it was possible. She was not willing to promise herself it wasn't. She only knew that she was standing in a corridor she had not expected to ever stand in, next to a person she had spent 3 years trying not to think about, and that neither of them was pretending the past had not happened, and that this, at least, was a place to begin. She turned and walked toward the working corridor where Petra's documents waited. "Tomorrow," she said without looking back, "I want to begin on the Eastern Pack agreements. We need to draft terms that don't repeat what Vane was building." "I have Owen arrange the session," Selim said. 7 in the morning, she said. "I work early." 7, he said. She did not look back. But she heard it in his voice, something that was not quite hope and not quite relief but was close to both. Something that had not been there when she arrived. She walked through the door into the next part of the work, carrying everything she had been given and everything she had built on her own, and she did not stop.